This Sunday briefing will start with a briefing by the governor of a state whose National Guardsmen were targeted by a terrorist this week outside the metro station closest to the White House. West Virginia Governor Patrick Morrisey, we want to thank you for joining us today. We know that you have no spare time leading West Virginia through this terrible terror attack. You're in West Virginia right now where there is a vigil today, or there are vigils today. What can you tell us about that and the rest of today's events?
Absolutely. Well, Peter, thank you for having me on. And obviously, it's been a very difficult few days as the whole state unites to pray for the soul of Sarah, who passed away, and then Andrew, who right now is fighting for his life. He's still in critical condition. Everyone in the state is zeroed in on how we can send as many prayers as possible to Andrew. And a lot of people are asking questions about how such an unfathomable evil act occurred.
And Governor, what can you tell us about the condition of Andrew Wolf, the guardsman who is still in the hospital here in Washington?
Well, nothing's changed from what we've heard. He's still in critical condition. You know, I had a chance to be at the hospital yesterday. And I want to tell you something. When you go there, sometimes when you go to a hospital, a lot of people are very concerned. People certainly are here. But the positive energy, the spirit that the families bring to bear, that his friends have, everyone is rooting for him so hard to make it to that next level. And it's really encouraging to see. I believe that the parents, the friends, I certainly believe that prayer can help really lift him up and help him recover.
And has Andrew Wolf been able to share with you or with any of the authorities investigating anything about the attack and how it unfolded yet?
You know, right now that's going through a comprehensive investigation. All we know is that it was a really nasty hit job, and obviously this was premeditated. And so we're going to have to wait till the investigation goes forward. But I will say this. No one should have ever been put in that type of situation. I do want to call on and thank the West Virginia Guardsmen who stepped up. I think through their bravery, they helped neutralize the gunman and probably prevented further injury and death. So there were a lot of very brave people stepping up on that day. Obviously, Andrew and Sarah, it's just an absolute travesty what happened. But now we get to root for Andrew's recovery.
And in the last few days, you have learned a lot about the too short life of Specialist Sarah Beckstrom. What can you tell our audience about her?
You know, it's interesting. Last night, there was a vigil in Webster County, West Virginia, where Sarah is from. And what you consistently heard is how much she was loved by everyone around her, how she was courageous. She just had such a sparkle in her eye, an amazing smile. And she also was dedicated to service. She cared a lot about serving her state and serving her country. And one important point, Peter, is that both Andrew and Sarah, they were there for the mission. They both volunteered. There's a lot of people criticizing the Guard, and they're criticizing what happened. And these two individuals, and in fact, everyone who's there from West Virginia right now, they're volunteers. And when you volunteer for the mission, a good mission, something that's actually been working in Washington, D.C., it should really shut a lot of these people up and hopefully unify the American people that these people were doing good. I think President Trump was doing the right thing. I know in West Virginia, we have their back.
Governor, the U.S. spy agencies doing the background checks of Afghans coming to the U.S. as Kabul fell did not do a good job. We know that now. Who could have seen this coming? Roll this tape. Is there any concern that maybe trying to reach this deadline and get everybody out, mistakes are being made now that there is a report that at least one of the Afghans evacuated to Qatar has suspected ISIS ties?
Well, first I would say we have a stringent vetting process which includes background checks before any individual comes to the United States. So I can't speak to one individual, but I can tell you and confirm for you that we take the vetting of any individual who comes to the United States and comes out incredibly seriously.
Well, more than one now. Governor, do you think this terror attack could have been avoided?
It absolutely could have. And let's go back a few years. I know when I served as the West Virginia Attorney General, we were part of lawsuit after lawsuit trying to end the Biden border disorder. And this is the natural consequence of having an open borders policy. What's happening right now is that President Trump and his administration have to clean up from all the different policy challenges that have been put on their lap. And this is just one of them. I was very pleased to see that President Trump had announced that they were changing the vetting procedures. I think that'll be very helpful. And also, I think his pause in terms of people coming into the United States is beneficial as well. It's time to do a thorough review of everyone who came in under these very questionable circumstances, because there are millions and millions and millions of people that came in, and some of them who came through an asylum or other policy loopholes. I think that could raise big problems in the future, and we may not be done yet.
Governor, there has been a lot of talk among critics the last few days that this attack never should have happened because these National Guard never should have been sent to Washington, D.C. or to any other big city. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, the mission that President Trump articulated, it's working. Crime is way down in Washington, D.C., and I want to emphasize again that the people that are there right now in Washington, D.C. from West Virginia, every single one of them is a volunteer. So you're going to criticize these people who are going in to try to provide safety in the nation's capital? What kind of society have we come to when that's a controversial topic? I know that the people in West Virginia and the Guard very strongly supported this mission. And once again, when it came to the remainder of the year, I sent the word down, let's make sure that people want to volunteer to do this. There was no pressure put on them. These are people that stepped up who believed in the mission, who believed in our country, who believe in our state. And so I don't know how people can criticize that ever.
Governor, we are thinking of West Virginia, our audience, all thinking of West Virginia. Thank you very much for being here today, and please come back with any updates.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.